Finally, a British rock star with a new take on the birth of rock and roll. Jeffrey Brown has the story.
He's back in fashion, pure accident, waiting to happen.
Billy Bragg first rose to fame as a punk rock and folk musician in the early 1980s.
And the sleep of reason produces monsters.
Now nearing 60, he's still singing hard-edged songs of protest and passion. Here recently at the Birchmere Music Hall in Alexandria, Virginia.
Kids are outright giving license to all this hate.
In a new book, Roots, Radicals, and Rockers, he's also looking back to an even earlier, lesser-known but important moment in music history. When a pop star named Lonnie Donegan and others took Britain by storm in the mid-1950s with a phenomenon called skiffle music.
What Donegan does, he's the first British artist to get in the charts playing a guitar, and he begins the process of turning it into a guitar-led, British pop into a guitar-led music for teenagers. As the guitar becomes a kind of way that our youngsters express the fact that they're different from their parents. As the guitar becomes the way that they start to try and make the future happen.
They did it, though, by listening to the past, to skiffle's roots in African-American culture, including traditional New Orleans jazz and the great American folk and blues musician Huddie Ledbetter, known as Leadbelly. Lonnie Donegan had a hit in 1956 with Leadbelly's Rock Island Line. And British kids picked up cheap acoustic guitars, homemade tea-chest basses, and washboards to play something akin to American jug band or rockabilly music. Bragg says it was a turning point for British culture, still coming out of its post-war depths.
Just a month before Lonnie Donegan records Rock Island Line, food rationing ends in the UK. It goes on after the Second World War because we have a huge balance of payments problem. Some things are rationed after the war that are never rationed during the war. Bread, for instance, was rationed for a short while after the war. So the kids who are playing skiffle have grown up not being able to go into a sweet shop and buy whatever they want. All of a sudden, they're 14, 15, 16, they're leaving school, they're going to work, they're getting paid reasonably well in the post-war boom, and they want something that identifies them as different, and skiffle becomes that thing for the young men.
Among those young men, 14-year-old James Page, here on the BBC with his skiffle band.
Do you play anything except skiffle?
Yes, Spanish and dance.
Do you as well?
Jimmy Page would later become one of rock's biggest stars as the guitarist for Led Zeppelin. And he was hardly the only rocker to start out in skiffle.
Well, Van Morrison was 12. You know, George Harrison was 13 when he saw Donegan, McCartney 14, Lennon 16.
Those are big names later on, right?
Yeah. Teenagers, when they saw that, they knew that this was the future and that they needed to get hold of one of those guitars. I mean, sales of guitars, acoustic guitars this is, went from 5,000 in 1 year, 3 years later, to 250,000 guitars in a year. And they're all playing in, you know, there's not a scene. Yeah. They're playing in back rooms and you know, church halls, but it's what they do subsequently when they're 20, 25 that really makes a difference.
John Lennon and Paul McCartney's first group, the Quarrymen, started as a skiffle band. The rest, as they say, is history.
3,000 screaming teenagers are at New York's Kennedy Airport to greet, you guessed it, the Beatles.
As young British musicians plugged in, threw out the old-timey skiffle sounds to create their own, and brought that back across the Atlantic in the British invasion.
From January 1964 to December 1965, there's a British group at #1 in the American charts for 52 weeks out of 104. Every single one of them begins as a skiffle group. The only exception is Petula Clark. And she didn't need Lonnie Donegan to help her out. She'd already put out 12 singles before skiffle started. But everybody else, Chad and Jeremy, the Rolling Stones, the Tremolos, the Animals, all have their roots in skiffle. Skiffle liberates those bands to get out there and play music at such a young age that when the Beatles break the charts in America in January '64, there's a whole cohort of British bands who've been playing for years who are ready to go. And it takes American youth a little longer to catch up.
Skiffle gave them the means, the something to get up with a guitar.
It's the sense of empowerment that came with skiffle to very young people, to make them think they can make their own music, to not wait for someone else to make it. That's a very similar impulse to punk rock. And I think that's what drove the Beatles and all those other bands to write their own material.
Thought I heard that Casey when she mowed.
For his part, Billy Bragg has continued to write his own songs while also working within traditions of the past. His most recent album, Shine a Light, with the American singer-songwriter Joe Henry, was largely recorded in railway stations around the U.S.
Now the rich man took my home.
And at the Birchmere concert, Bragg offered a beautiful version of a Woody Guthrie song.
And I ain't got no home in this world anymore.
But when I asked about his own coming-of-age skiffle-style moment, he turned to his punk rock roots.
The Clash.
The Clash.
More or less, yeah. I saw The Clash when I was 19. Me and some friends of mine had been really interested in bands like Dr. Feelgood and The Jam, who were stripping it back. And we went to see The Clash at the Rainbow in 1978. And it seemed to... It's one of those watershed moments. It's like when the Skifflers heard Donegan. It's that, you know, that sort of ability to make your own culture that came with punk rock that really it keeps me going. That's why I thought I could sit down and write a book about skiffle rather than wait for someone to ask me.
Let's break it down and start again.
For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jeffrey Brown from the Birchmere Music Hall in Alexandria, Virginia.
Let's stop pretending that we can manage our way out of here. Let's stop.
And we thought we knew all about rock and roll.